You there, Russ? Juan Carlos the First.
He made Australia laugh louder than almost anyone else. A household name, a face that lit up screens, and a presence that felt like home every Saturday night. But one day, Russell Gilbert disappeared, and the world that once roared with laughter suddenly went quiet. What happened to the man who brought joy to millions? Why did he vanish from television, from comedy, from life itself? The answer is as tragic as it is haunting. In 2015, Russell Gilbert's longtime partner and fiancée, Rochelle Nolan, took her own life. Just days later, Russell was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The double blow was too much. The man who had been the life of the party crumbled into a silence no one expected, and from which he never fully returned. This is not just the story of a beloved comedian. It is the story of a man torn apart by love, grief, and illness. A man who had given his heart to making others happy, only to lose everything he cherished in a matter of days. Behind the laughter, behind the costumes and punchlines, behind the bloopers and gags, was a private world of devotion, loss, and mental collapse. No one knew just how deep Russell Gilbert's suffering went. No one could believe the smiling face on screen was hiding such unthinkable pain. Tonight, we pull back the curtain. This is the story of Russell Gilbert. The fall that no one saw coming, the silence that screamed louder than any joke, and the heartbreaking truth of what happens when the funniest man in the room loses the one person who made him whole. To understand the magnitude of Russell Gilbert's rise and his devastating fall, we need to revisit the golden era of Australian television comedy. It was the late 1980s and early 1990s, a time when sketch shows dominated primetime, and variety programs were not just popular, they were cultural institutions. At the heart of it all was a boy from Footscray, Victoria, who would go on to become one of the country's most beloved comedic figures. Russell Gilbert's television journey began humbly, performing stand-up routines at local comedy venues in Melbourne. But his undeniable charisma, lightning-quick timing, and uniquely Australian humor caught the eye of producers, and before long, he was cast in one of the most iconic TV shows of the time, Hey Hey, It's Saturday. The variety program, hosted by Daryl Summers, was a chaotic and colorful blend of live music, slapstick games, and irreverent skits. In this unpredictable environment, Russell thrived. He wasn't just funny, he was magnetic. His appearances on the Great Aussie Joke segment became instant hits, and his chemistry with Summers and the rest of the cast made him a fan favorite. But Russell wasn't just a side character. His talent was undeniable, and it wasn't long before he was given his own spotlight. In 1998, The Russell Gilbert Show debuted, followed by Russell Gilbert Live and Russell Gilbert Was Here. These were not minor projects, they were major productions, primetime shows that solidified his status as Australia's funny man. Off-screen, Russell was known as warm, humble, and generous, rare traits in the industry. He never courted scandal. He wasn't tabloid fodder. Instead, he quietly built a legacy through hard work, laughter, and a deep sense of gratitude to the audience that adored him. But behind that joyful persona was a man deeply devoted to the one person who stood by him through all the highs and lows, Rochelle Nolan. She wasn't just his partner. She was his foundation, his stability. They shared more than 2 decades together, choosing love and loyalty over flashy headlines. Friends describe their relationship as genuinely affectionate, something rare in showbiz. There was no need for a wedding, though they were engaged, because their bond was unshakable. In interviews, Russell would light up when mentioning Rochelle. She was the one who kept him grounded while the rest of the world laughed. But in 2015, everything shattered. Rochelle's unexpected death was more than a tragedy. It was the event that unraveled the man Australia thought they knew. And it came with another cruel twist. A terminal diagnosis that would not only end Russell's career, but threaten his very sense of self. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audiences moved on, Russell disappeared, not into retirement, but into something much darker. What happened next remains one of the most heartbreaking and little-known stories in Australian entertainment. Russell Gilbert's rise to fame was never about ego or ambition. It was about joy. Growing up in the working-class suburb of Footscray, he didn't have industry connections or a legacy to inherit. What he had was a natural gift for comedy, a magnetic personality, and an instinctive understanding of timing that couldn't be taught. His earliest days on stage were spent in Melbourne's thriving stand-up scene during the 1980s. At a time when Australian comedy was raw, unpredictable, and deeply local, Russell's everyman charm made him a standout. He could be outrageous without being offensive, silly without being hollow. That authenticity opened the doors to television, where he would soon become a mainstay. His first big break came with the Comedy Company, but it was Hey Hey It's Saturday that turned Russell into a household name. Appearing regularly throughout the 1990s, he quickly became known for his wild impressions, cheeky wit, and the ability to create hilarity out of nothing. There was something delightfully chaotic about his performances, unpolished but never sloppy, spontaneous yet deeply controlled. By the mid-1990s, Russell was no longer just a supporting player. With Channel 9 backing him, he was given his own vehicle, The Russell Gilbert Show, a sketch comedy program that combined original characters, celebrity cameos, and fast-paced humor. It was followed by Russell Gilbert Live and Russell Gilbert Was Here, cementing him as one of the very few Australian comedians to headline multiple primetime shows under his own name. But he never let the fame get to him. Colleagues remembered him as one of the kindest people in the business, someone who remembered crew members' names, who never missed a birthday, and who always took time to help young comics find their footing. There was no scandal, no ego, just a man who loved making people laugh. Behind the scenes, Russell's world was anchored by one person, Rochelle Nolan. A radio producer by profession, Rochelle had met Russell years earlier, and the connection was immediate. They became inseparable, not in a performative red carpet way, but in a quiet, unshakable partnership. For more than 20 years, they shared a home, dreams, and plans for a future that never needed to be flashy. Their relationship was rarely in the press, not because they were hiding anything, but because there was nothing to sell. No breakups, no rumors, just a real, enduring love. Friends described them as soulmates. Russell would often refer to Rochelle as my rock, and it was understood that every joke he told, every laugh he gave, somehow led back to her. But the fairy tale began to fracture in 2015. Without warning, Rochelle took her own life. The news stunned their friends. There were no public warning signs. No farewell notes surfaced. For Russell, it wasn't just the loss of a partner. It was the collapse of the only world he had ever known. The tragedy alone was enough to destroy anyone. But fate, cruelly, had more in store. Only days after Rochelle's death, Russell was rushed to hospital with severe headaches. Doctors discovered a brain tumor. The diagnosis was serious, life-threatening, and would require surgery that risked damaging critical parts of his brain. Within a week, he had lost his fiancée and his health. And just like that, everything stopped. There were no farewell tours, no final appearances, no explanation to the public. Russell simply vanished from comedy, from television, from life. When the laughter died down, what remained was silence. An eerie, painful silence that echoed through the lives of those who knew Russell Gilbert best. After Rochelle's death, something inside Russell fractured. His friends, his colleagues, even casual acquaintances noticed it immediately. The man who once couldn't walk into a room without cracking a joke now struggled to speak. His eyes, once bright and mischievous, carried a weight no one could lift. The news of his brain tumor had barely sunk in when he was taken into surgery. The operation was deemed necessary, but high risk. Surgeons removed the mass, but it came at a devastating cost. The part of Russell's brain responsible for speech and short-term memory was permanently damaged. He could no longer perform. He could barely hold a conversation. The man who had made a nation laugh had lost the very tools that made him who he was. Those close to him described it as watching someone fade in slow motion. Glenn Robbins, a fellow comedian and longtime friend, once said he was still Russell, but only in pieces. You could see him trying to reach out from inside himself, but something was missing, something essential. Russell's withdrawal from public life was not voluntary, it was necessary. His mental health deteriorated rapidly after the surgery. The grief of losing Rochelle, combined with the cognitive decline, became too much to bear. He was placed under full-time care, surrounded by a small circle of loyal friends who vowed to protect him from the cruelty of the outside world. One of those friends, Mick Malloy, revealed in an emotional radio interview. We're trying to give him a good quality of life. But he's not the same Russell. The spark's gone. It's like the light's been dimmed. Publicly, there was a void. No statements, no tributes, no official announcement of retirement. For fans, Russell simply vanished. Some assumed he had quietly bowed out of the limelight. Others speculated about illness, depression, or burnout. But few knew the truth, that the man who once filled living rooms with joy was now confined to a life of forgotten memories, fading moments, and ghost-like silence. The media, to its credit, largely respected his privacy, but whispers remained. Fragments of gossip, rare sightings, glimpses of a once famous face now barely recognizable. He would occasionally appear at small comedy events, escorted by friends, but his presence was more symbolic than participatory. The stage was no longer his home. It was a reminder of all he had lost. And perhaps most tragically, Russell himself may not fully understand what he lost. Reports suggest his memory of Rochelle has faded. The woman who stood by him for decades, who laughed at every joke before the audience did, who held his hand through every career milestone, now just a flicker in a damaged mind. The story is almost Shakespearean in its cruelty. A man built on love and laughter, stripped of both. A life that gave so much to others, but received a heartbreak too immense to carry. Fans still remember. Clips of Russell's sketches continue to circulate online, often captioned with comments like, "This man made my childhood," or "No one like him today." And yet, behind every laugh is the knowledge of what came after, the void that followed the applause. Russell Gilbert's tragedy is not just about illness or death. It's about the unbearable weight of grief. It's about how even the strongest, kindest souls can be broken, and how sometimes the people who bring the most joy are carrying the most pain. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe Russell Gilbert's story is one of the most profoundly human narratives in Australian entertainment history. Not because it is filled with scandal, but because it reveals something far more haunting. What happens when laughter is no longer enough to save someone from unimaginable pain? Russell was never just a comedian. He was a cultural presence. For years, he stood as a beacon of feel-good Australian humor, the kind that didn't punch down or play cruel. His comedy was warm, accessible, and rooted in community. In a world increasingly cynical, he was refreshingly genuine. And that authenticity is what made his fall so heartbreaking. There were no warning signs. There was no dramatic spiral into addiction, no tabloid spectacle. What destroyed Russell Gilbert was grief, raw, undiluted grief. The kind that leaves you breathless. The kind that doesn't come in waves, but in one violent, unrelenting flood. It's tempting to call what happened to him a tragedy, and it is. But it's also a mirror. It shows us the hidden cost of being the funny one. Society often forgets that comedians, especially those who dedicate their lives to making others laugh, carry invisible weights. They make others feel better, often at the expense of their own well-being. Russell's love for Rochelle was the anchor in his life. He never used their relationship for attention or publicity. There were no dramatic headlines, no oversharing, just love, quiet, consistent, and true. And when she died, so did the part of Russell that knew how to function in the world. In many ways, Russell's disappearance from the spotlight feels like an indictment of how entertainment systems fail to care for their own. Where was the infrastructure? The safety net? The support? A man who gave so much ended up fading into the margins, cared for by a small group of friends while the industry moved on. But perhaps this is where the public comes in. The outpouring of love for Russell, even in his absence, reminds us that legacies don't disappear just because someone does. Fans still remember. They still share his clips, still laugh at his skits, still talk about the warmth he brought into their homes. That enduring affection matters. It's real. It's a form of memory that illness can't take away. What Russell Gilbert represents is more than a career cut short. He is a symbol of emotional honesty in a world of masks. He's a reminder that even those who give light to others sometimes sit in darkness themselves. As viewers, perhaps we owe it to Russell, and others like him, to carry forward more than just his jokes. We must carry forward the compassion, the kindness, the sincerity that defined who he really was. Not the star, not the headline, but the human. What do you think? Did Russell's story touch you in ways you didn't expect? Do you believe our entertainment world does enough to support those who give us joy? And most importantly, do you think we've forgotten the man behind the laughter for too long? Some stories fade quietly, others echo even in silence. Russell Gilbert's story is not about a fall from grace. It's about how deeply love and laughter are entwined and how fragile both can be. There was a time when his voice filled our living rooms, when his face was the promise of a good night, when his jokes stitched together families around the TV. He didn't try to be edgy. He didn't try to be cool. He was simply himself, and that was enough. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, the joy he spent decades giving to others disappeared from his own life. Rochelle's death wasn't just the end of a love story. It was the breaking of a spirit. And when Russell lost his ability to perform, it was as though a curtain had fallen, this time for good. But even now, his legacy lingers. In reruns, in online tributes, in late-night memories of shared laughter, Russell Gilbert remains. He is the laugh that comes unexpectedly, the warmth that stays long after the sketch ends. For those who grew up with him, he is a thread woven into the fabric of Australian pop culture, a reminder of a time when comedy felt innocent, kind, and heartfelt. No award, no headline, no viral clip can capture what he meant to the people who watched him. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest part. The greatest performers are sometimes remembered more for their absence than their presence. But now you know. Now you know the weight behind the smile, the sorrow behind the silence, the love that became both his foundation and his undoing. Some stories are never told, but now you've heard his. And maybe that's how we keep him alive, not in lights, not in applause, but in quiet remembrance, in choosing to smile even when we know how much it hurts to lose someone. Russell Gilbert may never return to the stage, but the laughter he gave us, that never really left.